Okay, so in this lesson, I want us to move this validation code out of the handler. So let's do a bit of refactoring. So what we want to do is, instead of having all of this validation code inside our create school handler, let's move it to where we have the school type defined. Okay, so if I go to data and schools, you'll notice that I have my school struct here. So what we will do is to have the validation code along with the actual school struct. So the validation for the school is with the school. So let me come back here to my validator. Where is it? My schools. Okay, and all of this I will remove. And I will place it here. Now, to make it easier to work with, I will simply create a function. So I'm going to have a function, and I'm going to call this function validate school. Okay, so how do we validate a school? Well, the first thing we need to do is to actually get the validator instance. Okay, so validator dot validator. Okay, so once we have V, we can work with our validation. And of course, we need something to validate. Okay, so where's the data coming from? Well, after we read in the data using read.json, then we know we have some data we can validate. So I'm going to do one thing though. I'm going to call that data school. Okay, so you haven't seen school before. All we've seen is input. Okay, so we have our input struct. So what I'm going to do, after I read into the input struct, I'm going to do one thing more, and I'm going to actually make a copy of the input. Okay, so I'm going to make a copy. So here I'm going to copy the values from the input struct to a new school struct. Okay, and so by doing this, it gives me the flexibility to remove any fields that I don't necessarily want. Of course, in this case, we would want to keep all of them. So I'm going to simply create a new school variable. Okay, and so I'm just going to make a copy of my school. So, okay, great. So what does a school need? Well, a school needs a name. Okay, and so I'm going to initialize name with input that name. Okay, level, I'm going to initialize with input that level, and I'm going to do the same for everything that we want to validate. Okay, so input that contact, yeah, and we have phone, input that phone, we have email, input that email, We have website, input that website. We have address, input that address. And finally, we have mode. So mode input that mode. Okay. So again, we read the request into our input struct. Then we make a copy of that input struct, which we will read into our school variable. Of course, some of you might simply say, well, why not we don't skip input and just read in the data into school? Well, if we do that, then we lose control of what exactly we want to permit. So because we have a school, and you notice a school has things like ID and created time and version, then the client could add those in to the request. Okay, and that's not what we want. So we do it in 2 steps. This is what we want, and so the client must provide these things. That's our input. We're restricting what we want as the input. And so we just make a copy of that, and that's what we're going to use. So once we have our school data, all right, we can now go back here, and so that's what we will pass in. So we'll actually pass in that school struct. Okay, so I'm going to paste all my validation checks, and obviously it's telling me input doesn't exist anymore, and so I'm just going to change this from input to school. Okay. Oops. Let's try that again. Okay. All right. So now we're saying school.name, school.level, school.contact, and so on. All right. And so we're performing the validation checks like before, except we're actually performing the validation checks on a school. All right. Not on the input, but on the school. All right, so the validation checks goes along with the actual type that it's validating. Okay, great. Let's close this. Let's go back to our handler. Okay, so now we have our handler, and what we're going to do is to simply, we're going to keep the validator in here, V, right? So the validator V will remain in our handler. Okay, so let's now perform the validation. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to call our function. So I'm going to say data that validate school. And I'm going to pass in the 2 things that is required, the validator, right, which is a pointer, of course. And then I'm going to pass in a pointer to the school. But since it's already a pointer, I just simply need to use the name school, right? So school is already an address because it's an address. Okay, so once I have this, I will then use that as my condition. So we're going to execute that function, and depending on whether validation passed or failed, we will know whether we have entries in the map or we don't. So that's what I'm going to check. I'm going to say if not v.valid, okay, So it means that there are entries in the map, and so there was a validation failure, right? So call our validate school function and then check to see if there are any entries in the map. If they are, meaning this turns out to be false, then I want to give that failed validation response and then return. Okay, and that's it. We have refactored our code. So what we can do now is to simply start our server again and ensure that our program still works as intended. Okay, let's start my terminal. All right, our server, not terminal, starting our server. What was I saying just now? Okay, so we have that. Let's run it. We get something incorrect. Let's create another one. Okay, we also get error. And let's pass in a good one. Okay, and that works. Okay, so what we did, we refactored our validation code. We removed it from the handler and we placed it in the file where the type that it is validating has actually been defined. Okay, I'll see you in the next lesson where we will work on making email and website. Oh, where are we? Let's go back. Yeah, we're going to make email and website optional. So if the user doesn't include it, it will not force us to include it. Okay, so in the next lesson, we're going to see how that works. I'll see you then.